Hey everyone, it's Marvin. If you think the US needs better representation for minorities, especially during this election season, then you should check out The Future of Our Former Democracy, the chart-topping history podcast from More Equitable Democracy and Larj Media. Each week on The Future of Our Former Democracy, hosts George Cheung and Colin Cole dive into what our democracy could look like if we left behind our current winner-take-all model and embraced a fairer, more proportional system. If you need somewhere to start on this podcast, I recommend listening to the first episode where George discusses how his identity as a queer Asian American fueled his activism and commitment to social justice. Follow The Future of Our Former Democracy wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And on this episode, we have an author chat with Joanne Howard about her debut novel, Sleeping in the Sun, which follows the story of a servant and the youngest son of an American missionary family in India during the last days of the British Raj. As always, we are supported in part by our listeners at patreon.com/booksandboba. So if you'd like to become a bigger part of our book club, head on over. Our Patreon supporters gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as monthly bonus podcasts.
Yeah, but we had a great conversation with Joanne and like her family history, because her book is based on her family's history in India when they were missionaries. We talked about power dynamics in the home and also in politics during this time in the British Raj. And we talk about her writing journey. This was like her first book, like right out the gate. She started writing it when she was still in college. So it was great to hear just like how this journey evolved as she continued writing.
Yeah, it was a really fun conversation, and I really hope you enjoy. So without further ado, here is our author chat with Joanne Howard.
And we are here with Joanne Howard to talk about her debut novel, Sleeping in the Sun, which releases on October 22nd. Welcome to the show, Joanne.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is actually the first podcast I've been on, so thank you so much for inviting me.
Oh my goodness, that's so exciting.
That's awesome.
So I like to start our conversation with a little icebreaker. So I kind of stalked you online, and it looks like you are a pretty great bookstagrammer who likes to travel and writes book reviews. So what was the last book you've enjoyed reading on a trip?
So back in May, I went to Singapore, and I if I can, I tried to bring with me a book that's set in the place that I'm traveling to. So on this trip, I brought The Great Reclamation by Rachel Cheung, I believe, which I saw that you have a podcast interview with her.
We had her on the show.
I listened to it. Yeah, it was really great. Yeah, I loved that. And it's so interesting how Singapore has actually, grown in land mass. Like that's such a unique aspect to Singapore. And that novel really explores that in a magical realism kind of story. So I really recommend it. I loved it.
That's pretty cool. I typically because of this podcast, my TBR list is just packed to the brim of books. So that's usually just on my list when I go travel. I'm just like trying to catch up with all the readings that we have to do for this podcast. But that's pretty cool that you like to read thematically.
Yes. And now you also have a book rec if you travel to India. You've got my book, Sleeping in the Sun.
Yeah. So since you've listened to our show, you should know that we love to start off our author chats, learning more about our authors, journeys, how they became a writer. Can you tell us a little bit about how you became a novelist?
Sure. So basically, ever since I can remember, I have loved books, huge reader. We actually have like a family video of me before I even know how to read. And I'm just like sitting with a book and just like making up a story out loud to like what I'm seeing. So I've always loved stories and books. And I always knew that I wanted to write a book at some point in my life, and hopefully multiple. But this story really came one Thanksgiving when I was still in college, and we were just kind of all passing around our family documents. We have a lot of family archives kind of stuff, like autobiographies and photos and diaries. As a lot of families do. And I knew that my grandpa was born and raised in India, and they had a whole life there, but I don't think I really had explored the details of that until this Thanksgiving dinner. And it just like came to life to me, like the details of life in India at that time were just so descriptive and vibrant and lively. Like there were stories of like finding a panther in the kitchen, or, you know, like just like crazy things like that, that just sounded like they, you know, could go so well in a story. And so this was back in college when I was earning my bachelor's in English, so lots of literature in my studies. And then after that, I earned an MFA in creative writing from Pacific University in Oregon. So that program was where I really, in earnest, started writing this novel. It became the thesis for that program. So it definitely got a really strong start. I think it's tough to really know where to start as a debut novelist. You know, you've never written anything like that before. To start on your own is really tough. So I'm really grateful that I began with this program, because I got to work very closely with multiple professors who are authors themselves, and then of course being in this environment of all these other writer students as well. So that's how this book came to be. It took me years and years, but, you know, there's no rush. And, you know, the whole time I was working full time as well. I'm a copywriter professionally. So I do a lot of writing. So I just found little pockets of time to write along the way, and eventually finished my novel that way.
Wow, it's like really cool that your family had this history in India, and that they recorded it too, because I feel like that is actually not very common with a lot of immigrant and diaspora families. Actually, they try to keep mum about it, and they don't really share a lot of the secrets of their past life. So what was like the most surprising thing that you learned from your like excavation of your family's history?
You know, I think that the connection that they had with the Native Indian people that they met day to day was really quite strong. And I was really impressed and heartened by that, I think, because a lot of books about imperialism and colonialism are understandably like pretty negative, of course. A lot of people would argue that it did not have a good effect on a lot of countries. But, you know, my family, they did spend 34 years there, and they seemed pretty earnest in their work there. You know, they really were quite humble and saw themselves as guests in India, and they really like seemed to take a lot of effort to lay the groundwork and like form connections with people. So one of the examples of that is that it was actually very difficult to convert people to Christianity, because people in India would often be outcast if they did that. And so the way that my family would kind of approach it was more, what can we bring them in terms of just a day-to-day brightening of their lives? And one of them was that my great-grandfather would just like come to a village and play his flute, and he wouldn't even try to, you know, convert people, you know, immediately or anything like that. And so that really challenged my thinking, I think, of, you know, their place there. And I just liked that they seemed to be very earnest and good-natured in that sense.
Yeah, we definitely see a lot of those interactions in your book as well, which explores, you know, an American missionary family in British India. I guess for our listeners, can you give a brief, you know, synopsis of what your debut novel is all about?
Sure. So this story, it's set in the 1930s, which is a decade before India gains independence from Britain. And It's quite small in scope. It's just, it takes place over one season. It follows one family. It follows a young American boy named Gene Hinton. He is the youngest of four American brothers who are American missionaries. And he kind of just is, the bottom of the food chain in their family. The family is very kind of rowdy and rambunctious and athletic, and he is just kind of trying to find a bit of peace in his family's life. And then the other storyline is with Arthur, which is the family's Indian servant, and he kind of has this like personal awakening in terms of his identity. Like, it's almost like an identity crisis of how he has kind of served this American family his whole life. And when his friend kind of questions, like, was that really worth it? Are you happy? And he takes a step back and thinks about that. Like, was that the right choice in his life? Or could he have done something better for himself? And then the catalyst for the action in the book is that this high-ranking British judge named Uncle Ellis comes unexpectedly to stay with them. The family runs a boarding house, so it's normal for them to kind of have a lot of guests. And all of Gene's brothers are really excited to see him. They remember Uncle Ellis as being this great guy, but Gene is like kind of suspicious of him and is the only one to kind of wonder, like, why is this high-ranking British judge visiting this like very humble rural house? And also suspicious is Arthur, the Indian servant, who remembers the last time that the judge came to visit, and the judge is not nice to Arthur at all. And the two, Arthur and Gene, kind of do their own digging into Uncle Ellis to see what secrets are revealed.
Yeah, lots of little mysteries and questions to be answered while reading this book. The Hinton family is in a very unique position in the Midnapore society that they live in, because not only are they American and not British, they're also not wealthy. They are missionaries living in a very like humble home, like you said, running a boarding house. And usually when we see like foreigners in British India, we think of like wealthy aristocrats who have like a full staff. Like, why was that detail important for you to include in your book?
Well, I mean, I guess first and foremost, it was based in history, and that's really how my family was. And one of the images that really stuck with me when doing the research was the house that they live in, which in the novel I call it the big house, because it's massive. It's this big white concrete building, and it was actually a former home of British officers, and it was actually one of several homes in that area. But by the time that the Hintons move in, they have been abandoned by the British officers. They're, fallen into disrepair. There's the natural landscape is kind of moving back in on them. And I was so struck by that image of it symbolizes the end of things. It's the end of British rule. It's impending. It hasn't happened yet at this point in the novel, but it's clearly coming. So I liked the idea of that, and how like the American family who is quite poor fits well with that, I think, in the sense that they have this kind of different outsider place in society where they don't have far to fall like the British do. Like they kind of were always, well, not always because they weren't there as long, but they since the Americans were in India, they were kind of, flying under the radar a bit, I guess, and not, flying so high as the British. So I kind of like that idea. And then I think that their status and their financial situation kind of gave them freedom, I think, in terms of being able to connect with the Indian people and to not be so tied down to society's expectations of, how they had to behave or how they had to, relate to other people. But I think that another way that the American family of the Hinton stands out is kind of in their athleticism, which you'll see towards the end of the novel. There's this big athletic games that is held where they compete. It's kind of like the Olympics, but a smaller version. And I just liked there was kind of like a sense of American pride in that, and how the Hinton boys are like so athletic and so outgoing in a way that British people like were not, I think, because they were just much more, concerned with, appearing proper and appearing,
they don't want to look like they're desperate and working too hard.
Sure, exactly. Whereas like Americans are like, they're having fun, they don't have, they have the freedom to have fun, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked how your novel explores like those power dynamics in the colonial state, right? And even though a lot of your characters were born and raised in the country, we also see how like power and privilege shapes their identity. In your character's case, even when they're like not as wealthy as as the British colonists, they still enjoy some form of power just by virtue of being white in a system where whiteness equals power, right? So I feel like it's something that those of us looking to decolonize our thinking still struggle with a lot. Is just how do we also play into these structures? I guess my question is, what do you hope your readers can get out of reading your book in this regard?
I guess I would say that, the whole kind of question I pose in the novel is kind of like how the Hintons kind of see themselves as neutral, because, they aren't British, but exactly to your point, they are white. And so that they do get this kind of built-in privilege and respect in their society. And so the question for the reader by the end of the book is like, do you think that they really were neutral? Do you think that they had an impact on India, or on Midnapore at least? And if so, to what ends? Was that a good impact or a bad impact? And I try to leave it open-ended for the reader to make that decision for themselves. But there is a scene toward the end between Gene and his brother Lee. And Lee is the third brother who kind of acts as this like voice of reason and has this very kind demeanor to him. And Gene kind of asks so towards the end, they are preparing to leave India. And Gene asks Lee, do you think we could have done more? Do you think he asks, a question along those lines. And Lee is kind of like, he tells himself that, just like I was saying with the moment of joy of just like playing the flute for this village, Lee kind of says, for one Sunday every week, we had this moment of joy with these people. And I leave that open-ended as, is that worthwhile enough, I guess? Is that okay? So yeah, it is a question that I think that a lot of books about colonialism ask. But I think that because of this kind of unique American angle, we can kind of come at the question a different way, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was cool to read because your story has 2 point of views, Gene and Arthur, and they're both kind of like in similar positions in their relative spheres, right? Like Arthur is a servant in this house, like the lowest on the totem pole, but Gene is also like the baby brother who is always put upon. I thought it was really... Was this always going to be did you always intend to write a dual POV story, or did you start with one point of view and then add another one later on?
Yeah. So no, I didn't actually intend for Arthur to be as equal of a point of view as Gene. So at first it was just Gene's point of view. They say write what you know. And of course, Gene is the part that's based on my family history. So I started with that. But then I think, and then at the time, I do want to address that it is currently a bit sensitive to write outside of your lived experience. So I was sensitive to that writing Arthur because I'm not an Indian man. So I did kind of keep him as more of a secondary character. But I think as I wrote the book, I just realized that his point of view is so important. And I think that to only have Gene's point of view, I think would limit the book a lot because he is quite naive, and he does eventually have, a coming of age moment and a realization. But I think Arthur's perspective as, a more mature character from India, he has a lot to say about the Hintons and their place in India and their impact. So I did eventually build him up actually pretty late in my writing process. I had actually written a whole first draft and was editing it without his storyline really in it. I did eventually build him up. But it took a while to really kind of give myself that permission to kind of explore his mindset.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, like, how did you go about building his mindset? Because you said like writing outside your lane as a writer can be a little bit like controversial these days. Did you like watch documentaries? Did you read like autobiographies of Indian men during that time? Like, how did you come up with his voice?
It was definitely inspired by a couple of characters. At first, it was The Remains of the Day, and then there's also a novel called Staying On by Paul Scott, which is also set in India, and they both follow like two servants who are older, and they're kind of like not towards the end of their life, but looking back. They're old enough to be looking back on their journey, and so first it was inspired by them, but then in order to really like capture the authenticity of his Indian identity, I just read as many works by Indian authors as possible. The two that really helped me were The Autobiography of an Unknown Indian by Nirad C. Chowdhury, and the second one was called Pather Panchali, which is translates to Song of the Road in Bengali, and that's a classic Bengali novel about a family who just kind of sets out on they're a rural family who just sets out on the road for just a better life opportunity elsewhere. And I really connected to those two stories. I think the Autobiography of an Unknown Indian was just so rich with details. It's by a Bengali man living during that time that the novel is set, and it's just really like well-rounded in terms of all aspects of life, from his childhood to his education, to his marriage, to family life, and just everything that you could possibly want. It was like an amazing roadmap to inspire Arthur. So yeah, I mean, that's really what I would recommend if an author were to kind of write outside their lane like that, to just, at least ground it in literature that has come before.
Yeah, research, and sensitivity readers, and the ability to take feedback. I think those are the three key elements in writing outside your lane. So Jean and his brothers were all born and raised in India, and that kind of makes them second generation immigrants. I know they are technically considered like expats because they are always expecting to go back to America. This is like a temporary stay, and they but their diaspora experience is drastically different from ours as Asian Americans. And like I kind of feel like Jean and his brother's experience are like the Uno reverse diaspora experience. So like how was it for you as an Asian American writer writing this experience of white boys who are technically second generation immigrants, but they function in society differently?
So yeah, it was interesting. You're definitely right in that. I like your idea of the Uno reverse card, but it is different. But in a way, it had a lot of similarities for me, at least. So I am half Asian. And I identified with the way that the Hintons, the brothers, like kind of are outsiders, but are also, they have like a very complex idea of their identity, I guess. Like they have a sense of home in a place that isn't necessarily their background. And yet they are kind of outsiders too, and there's a good scene at the end between Jean and Arthur where they talk about, is India home to them? And of course, Jean says, of course, like I was born here, I was raised here. It's the only place I've ever known. I've never been anywhere else. And so I kind of identified with that as well, being Asian American myself, and the way that he kind of has a complex idea of home. I think it's really for some people, it is very straightforward. And for others, there's a winding path to home.
Yeah, home is always going to be a complicated place for any diaspora person, anybody who is a second gen, third gen. And especially when you don't actually have lived in ties to the motherland, for sure. And It's just interesting because like Gene and his brothers, they've like lived in India for so long, but they're not like completely fluent in Bengali. They can't really read it, and also they like navigate India with a lot of privilege because they go to boarding school, and it's like it's a very unique position that they're in. They're like in an expat bubble, but at the same time, because of their financial status, they have like more connections with the Indian community. I thought it was actually funny how Mrs. Hinton, she does her own shopping and does her own cooking, and it's like, oh, she actually uses spices. Like this is this is amazing. How is she going to like get her boys to eat like white American food again? I don't know.
And there's a part at the end of the novel where the boys worry about like how is mother going to like get the ingredients in the US, and I think that actually comes from one of the autobiographies of my family members where when they moved back to America, they only knew the Bengali names of the spices, so they had to like actually learn like what they were in English in the US, even though like they're American, culture shock.
Yeah. So your book also features, in addition to your two main point of view characters, I like to think there's a third main character, which is a very good girl, a stray dog that is adopted in the middle of the book. And to be honest, like throughout the book, I was fearing for this dog's life because there's a constant threat of violence. That's a central theme in your book is like this constant threat of violence, like just through the fact of being in a colonial situation, right? Can you tell us about how you came to include your doggo in your book?
Yeah. So Moti is the dog. And it actually came about when I actually got my own dog for the first time in 2020. We adopted Cash, my dog, who was sleeping on the couch behind me. And I had never had a dog before. And so I just like, he is so like, he's like my heart dog. Like we are just like, so like that. And so of course, like somehow a dog found its way into my novel as well. And you can see a lot of Cash in Moti, I think. But I just liked the idea of the animals like kind of play a big they have a lot of symbolism in the novel. The first to appear, well, actually, I guess Moti is the first to appear as the dog, but the first one that I wrote was the leopard. And the leopard kind of symbolizes like a very pure, untouched version of India, or at least of like the natural world in India. And I liked bringing in Moti as this like other animal symbol, but that is kind of bridging the gap between man and nature. So the connection to nature and nature's kind of sense of home, especially for Arthur, is one of the themes of the novel. And I think Moti is kind of a good like catalyst between Arthur's world in civilization and then at the end in nature, as well as you'll see in the book what happens to Moti. But I will give a good spoiler alert, which is that Moti does not die in the book. I just want to say that. I know a lot of people like will not read books where dogs are killed, so don't worry, Moti does not die.
Yeah, I was actually, I mean, this might be a spoiler, but I was actually kind of surprised how integral Moti was, because like Uncle Ellis kind of colonizes the dog, and I was just like, I was not expecting that, because whenever we see dogs as characters in settings like these, like in settings where there's like this loom of violence, it's always like, oh, is this person a good person? Because it's always like a villain who like kicks the dog, and that's how you know that is like a bad person. But Uncle Ellis was like, yeah, this is my dog now, and was like very very like proactive in training Moti. So I'm curious as like what, like, was that originally the plan with Uncle Ellis, like taking in this dog or stealing this dog from Arthur?
Oh, thanks for bringing that up. As I was writing Ellis, I was conscious of maybe I was veering too like one-dimensional with him. Like he is the antagonist, and he, is this pretty horrible person. So I was conscious of like, maybe I need to reel it in a bit. And actually in my MFA program, we had a talk kind of about like evil characters and how actually niceness can be even more unsettling when it comes from an antagonist. So I tried to kind of use that concept with Ellis and the way that he treats Moti. And I think that you could kind of take Moti's connection with Ellis as a bit symbolic of the place that Indian people were during the Raj, in terms of, they had to kind of make this sacrifice and make this choice of like, how can I behave now in order to get something out of it now, and, like, because they're kind of in a bind where they don't have the power to overthrow the British Raj at this point. So what can they do? What are the choices that they have to make, the difficult choices in order to survive? And that's kind of like Moti, where she's not as conscious of that, I think, obviously, but as an animal, she is, just trying to survive. Like, and Uncle Ellis is here giving her treats and pets. And so it's very easy to understand why Moti would gravitate toward that. So.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, the way that Judge Ellis treats Moti, there's also a layer of like, he wants to own her, right? He wants to like, there's a different, I guess, flavor of how he treats Moti and how Arthur treats Moti. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic too. I mean, something that your book does share with a lot of, at least modern literature about colonialism is the theme that like, if you F around enough, you eventually do, find out. And Judge Ellis has F'd around a lot. And the climax of the story is essentially all of his like past deeds coming to head, right? It's not just his crimes as like an imperialist judge, but also like there's a lot of really interesting internal dynamics, especially within the Hinton family, that he's like very much entrenched in. I thought it was really interesting once you start like peeling back the layers and you start like unveiling the true like history between, like finding out exactly why Judge Ellis is so entwined with his family. It was a really interesting puzzle to start unraveling as we read your book.
I'm glad that you point that out, because again, like I said, I was weary of being of making him too one-dimensional. And I think that just as you said, you will see that there's a lot that goes into his background. And just like you said, like with the Hintons and Arthur especially, you'll see that this has been a long time coming. And he didn't just like come out of nowhere and started like, dropping bombs and stuff. But he has this like kind of pervasive like hold on the family, which is revealed at the end. So.
Yeah, like a recurring theme in your novel is like the corrupting influence of power. And this is not just like with Uncle Ellis in this house kind of like spewing anti-Indian sentiments, but also like, he is someone who has given this family wealth. And with that wealth, there is like corruption. And we also see like broad strokes on like how the British Empire has been affecting the Indian people, and how like that corruption has been like decaying the Indian government. And I just was so impressed by how you were able to juggle both like the frame of like imperial India, and then you have like the interpersonal power imbalance within the Hinton household. Can you like share how you went about kind of like balancing those two? Did you struggle with, keeping both of those like parallel to each other?
Yeah, I would say that I wanted to keep the story manageable, the narrative manageable. I didn't want to make this a whole historical text that, showed all my historical research and all that. So I was kind of conscious of, let's put the needs of the story first. So I wanted the historical background to just be exactly that, the background and the backdrop for the actual story. One of the lessons I learned from my MFA program was that the best stories can really be taken out of whatever context they're in and like put on something else, a different time, a different period, a different planet. And the story should still resonate with whatever universal truth that the story is all about. And any reader from any time period or place should be able to identify with that. And so I really tried to do that here by keeping the scope manageable. So it's just one family and one place, and the time period is pretty small in the novel. And I didn't want to make a big like sweeping statement about this time period. I think sometimes historical fiction can be taken a little too like literally, I guess, in terms of like, this is an exact representation of that time period. And of course, I of course wanted to like do my necessary research in order to bring the story to life, but I still wanted to just like make it a human story at its core.
Yeah, I totally get the idea of like historical fiction can be too grounded in reality and like the research swallowing the writer, and it's just like it's fiction for a reason. And
but there is a balance to be found though, of course, because if you're going to be inspired by this time period in this place, then like you should respect it enough to do enough research and make it as accurate as possible.
Yeah, totally. So like, was the book always titled Sleeping in the Sun? Because I thought it was like a clever reference to how like the Indian sun burns Jean's skin, and Arthur pleasantly bakes in it. So it's like two different Indias.
Yes, I think it was always the title. I just kind of liked that idea of, and this, I can take this personally as well, where like, some people can take heat really well. Not me, but there are some people who, they bask in it, they thrive in it, and they love the sun and they take enjoyment from it. But then there are other people who, like hate the sun. And especially in British India, the symbol of the pith helmet is very iconic of that time because, English people had very fragile skin. So I just kind of thought that was a good way in to explore this idea of home and, like connection to the natural world. Some people are, naturally suited to an environment, whereas others aren't. So, yeah, the idea of sleeping in the sun it's literally in there, as you mentioned, the scene. But there's also a scene with Moti and Arthur, where when Moti first comes in, it's a very hot day by the river, and I think it's Arthur who says only mad dogs and Englishmen would be out in the noonday sun. So yeah, there's this notion of like who can take the sun, who can take the heat, and how that relates to this notion of home, I guess.
Yeah, and also makes it really cute cover because you do have Moti on the cover of your novel. Can you talk to us about like why you decided to feature the dog on the cover?
Yeah, I think dogs are kind of like, Moti is kind of, she's not the main character, but she is in the middle of all of this, like as you can see between the tension between Arthur and the judge, and then Moti, it forms kind of like a weird triangle of like loyalty, So I just thought like Moti was like such a fitting symbol of what's at stake, like that there is this this whole nation at stake in between these people who are fighting for it. So yeah, I thought Moti was kind of like the best representation of that, and probably the easiest character for readers to root for.
Yeah, I mean, with the cover of the cute dog sleeping and the title of the book being Sleeping in the Sun, you think that it's going to be a very pleasant, cozy read. And it's like, actually, no, it's very unsettling. And the deeper you go, it's like there's
about that. Yeah, I did worry about that. I worried that some people like might pick it up and think it's like this quiet, cozy book, but no, ultimately, that's okay with me if they come in with that kind of expectation, but then they are surprised by the climax and the action in the end.
Yeah, and in its core, it's two stories of people coming of age, right? One obviously a little bit older, but coming of age, coming to a realization about themselves and their place in the world. And I did enjoy Gene's own coming of age. You wrote him really well, and that I can see that he's still a 12-year-old boy. He gets angry and makes rash decisions that again, F around enough, you find out. And I really enjoyed both the characters' growth and what they learn about themselves along the way. I think in those aspects, it's kind of a cozy read. There's just the sort of violence all around. That's all.
No, but I love that you pointed that out. There are life lessons to be learned at any point in life, I think. Yeah, and both Arthur and Gene at their ages demonstrate that.
I do want to give the women a shout out in your book. Obviously, the two main characters are Gene and Arthur, and then you have an antagonist who is also Uncle Ellis, a man. But Mrs. Hinton, Gia, and Sony, they have such a loud presence in the book, I think. Even though their roles seem very small, I feel like they represent the spaces that women have in this time period in India. So can you tell us about how you came up with these women characters, especially Gia and Sony, who are both Indian women, but they are in drastically different circumstances?
Yeah, I think that I intentionally had them be of different financial backgrounds. It will be revealed Jaya's background and how she, because she has the means, she is able to kind of move around with much more freedom. And she has much more ambition than Sony, who is basically literally confined to this courtyard in her family's home. And the reason will be revealed. But I did kind of want to highlight the options for a woman at the time and compare that with Mrs. Hinton, who is, a pretty independent American woman who, just like you said, she does her own shopping in the bazaar. She's kind of free to move about. She has the privileges of being a white woman and gets to kind of occupy that kind of neutral space in terms of just having that freedom to move around, basically. So yeah, I was conscious of representing three very different female experiences in India at that time.
Yeah, I think you did a great job showing those differences. And I was just self autonomy, autonomy comes in different forms for each of these women because, different circumstances and freedom is different for each one. And I thought that was really interesting to see. Yeah, we're winding down to the end of our interview. I think I would be remiss to not ask you, are you working on anything else? Do you have anything else in the pipeline?
Yeah, I am kind of exploring a new novel idea. It's more contemporary. It's set in modern times and it's closer to home. So I'm from Sonoma County. We had some pretty big wildfires in 2017. And I think that it's just kind of been, I guess I like this idea of looming danger or darkness. So it's kind of had this literal scar on the landscape here. And I'm kind of drawn to that in imagery and symbolism, I think. So I'm exploring a story set in post wildfire ravaged Sonoma County.
I mean, if there's anything we need more of these days, it's stories talking about, hey, maybe let's think about the climate more and natural
exactly.
disasters.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Joanne, this has been a really great conversation. Thank you so much for joining us at Books and Boba, and congrats on the launch of your debut. And
thank you so much.
Soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm going to celebrate with my boa. I got some.
Yay! What's your drink?
Awesome. This is taro with boba.
Yeah. Awesome.
Half sweet, half ice.
Good call. All right. Thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, guys.
And that was Joanne Howard. Her debut novel, Sleeping in the Sun, is available now at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookshop. So you can get your copy if you head on over to booksandboba.com and click on our bookshop link. As always, all purchases made on our online bookstore support not only us at Books and Boba, but also your local bookstores. And before we go, just a quick reminder that our October 2024 book club pick is The Salt Grows Heavy, a novella by Cassandra Khaw. it is a perfect spooky month read featuring flesh-eating mermaids, plague doctors, haunted forests. Having a lot of fun reading the book and looking forward to discussing all the spooks with you later, Vera.
Yay, Spooktober, my favorite month.
Yeah, so if you're reading along with us or have already finished the book, please let us know your thoughts either on Goodreads or our Discord server if you are a Patreon supporter. We'd love to get your feedback onto the podcast when we discuss it next week. But with that, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you once again to Joanne Howard for joining us, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Life gets a little crazy sometimes. Sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's beautiful, and sometimes it can just piss us off. Enter First of All Podcast. It's a safe space for real conversations about the things that we all struggle with, celebrate, contemplate, and work through in our daily lives. I'm your host, Mindy Chang. I'm an actor, filmmaker, and entrepreneur with a colorful background, a full life, and brilliant friends who I love to unpack life with to share with all of you. They are everyday people like you and me, ranging from award-winning artists, cultural icons, powerful CEOs, my hilarious childhood friends, and even my mom. Tune in for honest conversations on mental health, dating, sex, family, career, culture, and everything in between. Listen to First of All wherever you find podcasts, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.